The least important person in the room. Funny how a single sentence can reveal everything a marriage has become. The words drifted across the ballroom wrapped in laughter and the soft clink of crystal glasses, but they landed on me like a spotlight. For a second, I thought maybe I had heard her wrong. Maybe the music was too loud. Maybe the champagne had loosened a joke that wasn't meant to cut. Then I saw Rebecca smiling. Not nervous, not embarrassed, smiling. And suddenly there was no misunderstanding left. The Grand Regent Hotel glittered under chandeliers the size of pickup trucks. Gold lights spilled across white linen tables, polished silverware, and executives dressed in suits that probably cost more than my first car. It was the annual Harrington Global Leadership Gala, the kind of event where people shook hands, exchanged business cards, and pretended every conversation might change their future. Rebecca loved nights like this. She belonged here, or at least she believed she did. Standing across from me in a navy designer gown, she looked completely at home among vice presidents, board members, and department heads. Her laugh carried easily through the crowd. Her confidence seemed brighter than the lights above us. I used to admire that confidence. Back when it wasn't aimed against me, the conversation had started harmlessly enough. A group of senior managers had gathered near our table. Someone asked how Rebecca managed to balance such a demanding career with family life. She laughed and gave the kind of polished answer she'd perfected over the years. Then another executive glanced at me and asked what role I played in the company. Before I could answer, Rebecca raised her champagne glass and smiled. "Oh, Ethan doesn't work here," she said. A few people chuckled politely. Then she added, "Honestly, he's probably the least important person in the room." The laughter came instantly. Not cruel, not explosive, just enough. The kind of laughter people use when they want to belong. The kind that tells you exactly where you stand. I felt dozens of eyes slide toward me, waiting, measuring, judging. The strange thing about humiliation is that it doesn't arrive all at once. Creeps in. First comes disbelief, then comes silence. Then comes the realization that nobody is going to stop it. I could have defended myself. I could have explained who I was. I could have listed accomplishments, titles, projects, achievements. But something inside me refused. Instead, I stood there holding a glass of bourbon and watched the woman I'd spent 15 years loving enjoy the moment. Rebecca didn't even look at me afterward. She turned back to the group and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. As if I were furniture. As if I had already disappeared. Around us, the ballroom continued moving. Waiters crossed the floor carrying trays of appetizers. A jazz quartet played near the stage. Conversations blended into a low hum of ambition and self-importance. Life went on. But for me, something had shifted. Looking back now, that was the moment everything changed. Not because of what Rebecca said. Not even because of the laughter. It changed because someone else heard it too. Standing near the stage, partially hidden behind a cluster of executives, William Harrington lowered his glass and looked directly in my direction. The CEO hadn't said a word. He hadn't moved. Most people in the room hadn't even noticed he was there. But I noticed, and as our eyes met across the ballroom, I had the strange feeling that the night was far from over. Most people think humiliation happens in a single moment. It does not. The moment is only the receipt. The real damage is usually years in the making. I stood there watching conversations resume around me, the laughter already fading into the background noise of the ballroom. The strange part was that I was not angry. Not yet. I was tired. There is a difference. Anger burns hot. Exhaustion settles deep into your bones and makes you wonder how you ended up somewhere you never intended to be. I took a slow sip of bourbon and glanced across the room at Rebecca. She was smiling again, completely comfortable, moving from one group to another with the ease of someone who knew exactly how to command attention. People listened when she spoke. They laughed at her jokes. They leaned closer when she told stories. She had spent years building that reputation, and honestly, she deserved much of it. Rebecca was talented, intelligent, driven. I had never been threatened by her success. In fact, I had been one of the people cheering the loudest when she earned it. That was what made nights like this so difficult to understand. 15 years earlier, none of this had mattered. We met in Chicago during a freezing February that seemed determined to break snowfall records. I was a systems engineer working long hours for a manufacturing company. She was a junior marketing coordinator trying to climb her way up the corporate ladder. We were not impressive people back then. We ate takeout on second-hand furniture, split bills carefully, counted dollars before vacations. We spent Friday nights watching old movies because tickets downtown were too expensive. Back then, success was not something we measured against other people. Success meant paying rent on time. Success meant having enough money left over for dinner. Success meant building a future together. Somewhere along the way, the definition changed. Looking back, I could see the signs now. Small things at first. Rebecca becoming obsessed with titles, promotions, networking events, executive retreats. The conversations shifted from people to status, from experiences to influence. She started talking about who mattered and who did not, who was moving up, who was falling behind, who belonged in certain rooms, who did not. I told myself it was normal. Ambitious people think differently. That was the explanation I gave myself every time another piece of the woman I married seemed to disappear. The first time she introduced me as simply her husband, I laughed it off. The first time she interrupted me during a conversation with senior leadership, I ignored it. The first time she acted embarrassed by my job title, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Marriage teaches you many things. One of them is how easily you can explain away your own disappointment. Across the ballroom, Rebecca glanced toward me for a moment. Our eyes met. She smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a distant acquaintance. Then she turned away and continued talking. Something about that hurt more than the joke earlier. Not because it was cruel, because it felt practiced, familiar, like we had both been performing roles for a long time without admitting it. Near the stage, I noticed William Harrington speaking quietly with one of his assistants. He nodded once. The assistant disappeared into the crowd. I had no idea what they were discussing. I certainly did not imagine it had anything to do with me, at least not then. Because if there is one thing I learned that night, it is that sometimes the people paying the closest attention are the ones saying the least. People often assume important moments announce themselves. They imagine life-changing events arriving with dramatic speeches, flashing lights, or some unmistakable sign from the universe. In reality, the biggest turning points usually begin quietly. A glance, a phone call, a sentence that does not seem important until years later. At the time, I had no idea which category this night belonged to. I only knew I wanted it to end. I drifted toward the edge of the ballroom where the noise softened into a distant hum. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Thousands of lights scattered across the darkness like stars trapped beneath glass. From 30 floors up, everything looked smaller, simpler. Problems seemed manageable when viewed from a distance. Unfortunately, real life never stays behind the glass. My reflection stared back at me, 42 years old, a few gray hairs near my temples, a tailored suit I rarely wore. Nothing remarkable. Certainly not someone who belonged at the center of attention. That was fine with me. It always had been. The truth was, I had spent most of my career avoiding recognition whenever possible. Recognition attracts politics. Politics attracts ego. I preferred solving problems. For more than 18 years, that had been my role. Find the issue. Fix the issue. Move on. No headlines. No applause. No spotlight. Looking back, maybe that was my first mistake. People only value what they can see. The things done quietly often become invisible. A server passed carrying a tray of drinks. I declined politely and kept staring out at the city. Behind me, conversations continued. Deals were discussed. Promotions hinted at. Futures negotiated over expensive bourbon and practiced smiles. Somewhere in that crowd, Rebecca was thriving. I remembered when that success used to make me proud. Maybe it still did. That was the complicated part. Love does not disappear the moment disappointment arrives. Sometimes they sit side by side for years. My phone vibrated softly. A text message from our daughter, Emma, 20 years old, sophomore at Northwestern. She had inherited Rebecca's confidence and, thankfully, very little of her obsession with status. The message was simple. Hope the fancy party is boring. Save me a dessert. I smiled despite myself. For a moment, the weight in my chest eased. Emma had always had a talent for reminding me what actually mattered. Family, character, integrity, things that never appeared on business cards. I sent a quick reply promising to smuggle home something chocolate and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Across the ballroom, I noticed William Harrington again. This time he was standing with two board members near the stage. One of them handed him a folder. William opened it briefly, scanned the contents, then closed it with a slow nod. Something about the exchange felt deliberate, focused, not the casual conversation of executives making small talk. I told myself it was none of my business. Probably was not. Yet every time I looked toward the stage, I found William speaking with another person, then another, as though pieces of a puzzle were quietly falling into place. The strange thing was that nobody else seemed to notice, least of all Rebecca. She was laughing with a group of senior vice presidents now, completely unaware. Watching her, I remembered a conversation from years earlier. We had been sitting in our first house surrounded by unpacked boxes. The place smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Rebecca had rested her head on my shoulder and said something I never forgot. She said that no matter how successful either of us became, we would always be on the same team. At the time, I believed her completely. Standing in that ballroom years later, I found myself wondering when exactly we had stopped being teammates. And somewhere near the stage, a man who knew a great deal more than I realized was preparing to answer a question I had not even thought to ask. The older I get, the more I believe relationships rarely break all at once. Most of the time they erode quietly, one small disappointment at a time. A missed conversation, a forgotten promise, a moment when someone chooses ambition over kindness. Then another, until one day you look around and realize you are standing in the ruins of something that used to feel permanent. As I watched the city lights beyond the ballroom windows, memories began surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. Rebecca had not always been the woman everyone saw tonight. There was a time when she celebrated the little things. Back when promotions meant pizza on the living room floor because we could not afford a nice restaurant. Back when success felt shared instead of owned. I still remembered the night she got her first management position. We were living in a modest two-bedroom house outside Chicago. The furnace barely worked during winter and the kitchen cabinets needed replacing. Rebecca came through the front door holding the offer letter like it was a winning lottery ticket. She was crying, laughing, talking so fast I could barely understand half of what she was saying. I picked her up, spun her around, and told her I was proud of her. And I meant every word. Later that night, she sat beside me on our old couch and promised something. She said that no matter how far her career took her, she would never become one of those people who measured human worth by job titles. The irony of that memory was almost enough to make me laugh. Somewhere between then and now, the promise had quietly disappeared. At first, the changes were subtle. Rebecca became more focused on networking events. Then came executive dinners, leadership retreats, industry conferences. Every conversation slowly shifted toward influence, visibility, and perception. She started analyzing people differently, not by character, by utility, what doors they could open, what opportunities they represented, what connections they possessed. Looking back, I realized the questions changed too. She stopped asking whether someone was kind. Instead, she asked whether they were important. I noticed it years ago but convinced myself it was temporary. A phase. Pressure from corporate culture. The rationalizations came easily because admitting the truth felt harder. Admitting the truth meant acknowledging that the woman I loved was becoming someone I barely recognized. A burst of applause pulled me back to the present. Across the ballroom, guests were taking their seats as the evening program prepared to begin. Rebecca remained surrounded by executives. Confident, animated, perfectly at ease. She never looked in my direction. That should not have bothered me as much as it did. Yet somehow it did. Not because I needed attention. Because once upon a time, she would have crossed the room just to stand beside me. Near the stage, William Harrington was now reviewing notes with two assistants. One handed him another document. He read it carefully. His expression remained calm, but there was something deliberate in the way he studied the page. As though he was verifying details rather than preparing remarks. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear. Not excitement. Curiosity. The kind that arrives before a storm you cannot yet see. Then I noticed something even stranger. One of the board members pointed briefly in my direction. William followed the gesture and looked straight at me. Not through me. At me. The moment lasted only a second before he returned to the conversation. But it was enough. Because suddenly I remembered a project from 8 years ago. A project almost nobody talked about anymore. A project that nearly failed before it ever launched. And for reasons I could not explain, standing in that glittering ballroom surrounded by strangers, I had the unmistakable feeling that the past was about to walk back into the room. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as guests began finding their seats. Conversations softened into a low murmur, the kind that fills a room moments before something important begins. I remained near the windows for another minute before finally making my way back toward our table. Rebecca was already seated, scrolling through messages on her phone. She barely glanced up when I sat down. "The program is starting," she said casually. "Not where have you been. Not are you okay. Just an observation, delivered with the same emotional investment someone might give a weather report." I nodded and looked toward the stage. A massive screen displayed the company logo, while soft instrumental music drifted through the speakers. Around me sat people who controlled budgets larger than most towns. Executives, investors, board members, the kind of people Rebecca spent years trying to impress. Years ago, I might have felt intimidated sitting among them. Tonight, I felt something else entirely. Distance. As though I was watching a world that no longer belonged to me. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the annual leadership gala. Applause rolled through the room. Awards were presented. Departments were recognized. Growth numbers flashed across the giant screens. The audience responded exactly as expected. Smiles, nods, polite laughter, everything carefully scripted, everything predictable. Yet William Harrington remained unusually quiet. Seated near the front, he seemed less interested in the presentations than in the people around him. Several times I noticed him speaking briefly with assistants. Papers exchanged hands. Notes were reviewed. Every few minutes, another quiet conversation took place. The pattern continued long enough that even I could not ignore it anymore. Beside me, Rebecca leaned toward a senior vice president and whispered something that made him laugh. She looked happy, comfortable, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. Looking back now, that may have been the last truly comfortable moment she experienced that evening. The awards segment ended and another round of applause echoed through the ballroom. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it is now my honor to welcome our Chief Executive Officer, William Harrington." The room erupted in applause. William stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the stage with the calm confidence of a man who never needed to demand attention because attention arrived on its own. He thanked everyone for attending, thanked the employees, thanked the leadership teams, thanked the shareholders. Standard remarks, familiar remarks, the kind everyone expected. Then something changed. William paused, not for a second, longer, long enough for the room to notice. His eyes moved slowly across the audience. The ballroom grew quieter. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "every year we celebrate achievements, promotions, revenue growth, expansion, important things." He smiled faintly. "But tonight I would like to talk about something we rarely discuss." The room listened. Gratitude. Another pause followed. Because some of the most important contributions to an organization never appear in quarterly reports. I felt a strange sensation settle in my stomach. Not fear. Recognition. Like hearing the first notes of a song you have not heard in years. William continued speaking, his voice steady and deliberate. Sometimes the people who protect a company's future are not the people standing under spotlights. Around me, executives nodded politely. Rebecca checked her phone one last time before placing it on the table. Nobody seemed to realize where the speech was heading. Nobody except, perhaps, William himself. Then he closed the folder resting on the podium, looked directly into the audience, and said something that caused the entire room to become completely silent. "Tonight," he said, "I want to recognize someone who never asked for recognition." The silence that followed felt different from ordinary silence. This was the kind that pulls every eye toward the same place. The kind that makes people stop checking their phones, stop whispering to their neighbors, and start paying attention. William Harrington rested both hands lightly on the podium and allowed the moment to settle over the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the servers standing near the walls seemed frozen in place. "The person I am about to mention," William continued, "spent nearly 2 decades solving problems most people never knew existed. Not because he wanted credit. Not because he wanted recognition. Simply because the work needed to be done." A few executives exchanged curious looks. I felt my pulse begin to climb. Slowly, steadily. The same feeling I used to get before a major project review. Not panic. Anticipation. William opened the folder beside him. 8 years ago, this company faced one of the most significant operational crises in its history. Now the room was fully engaged. Board members leaned forward. Senior leadership listened carefully. Rebecca straightened in her chair. "Most of you never heard about it because the crisis never became public," William said. "And it never became public because one employee found a solution before the problem reached our customers." A giant screen behind the stage illuminated with the image of an older manufacturing facility. I recognized it immediately. The Denver Systems Integration Center. My stomach tightened. William continued. "At the time, a critical systems failure threatened to delay a nationwide rollout that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in contractual obligations. Weeks of work, thousands of jobs, years of planning. The audience remained completely silent. Consultants were brought in. Analysts reviewed the data. Multiple teams worked around the clock. Nobody could identify the source of the issue. I remembered those weeks. Long nights, empty conference rooms, cold coffee, whiteboards filled with diagrams. Nobody sleeping enough. Nobody admitting how serious the situation had become. William looked toward the screen. Then one engineer submitted a report that challenged every assumption we were making. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. Beside me, Rebecca slowly turned her head in my direction. "His findings were initially dismissed," William said. "Not because they were wrong, because they were unexpected." A faint smile appeared on the CEO's face. Fortunately, he was stubborn enough to keep pushing. Soft laughter rolled through the ballroom. William waited for it to fade. His analysis proved correct. His solution prevented a catastrophic failure. His recommendations saved the rollout, protected our clients, preserved thousands of jobs, and ultimately safeguarded the future growth of this company. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning overhead. William closed the folder. What impressed me most was not what happened afterward. He paused. It was what did not happen. His eyes swept across the audience. No interviews, no self-promotion, no demands for recognition, no requests for special treatment. He returned to work the following Monday as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Several people laughed softly. Others nodded. Rebecca was no longer looking at the stage. She was staring directly at me. William's expression grew serious again. In an era where everyone is encouraged to advertise their value, this individual chose something different. He chose humility. Then the CEO looked straight toward our table. Straight toward me. "And tonight," he said, his voice carrying through every corner of the ballroom. I believe it is finally time everyone knew his name. For a moment, nobody moved. It felt as though the entire ballroom had forgotten how. Hundreds of people sat frozen between curiosity and realization, waiting for the answer William Harrington was about to give. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, steady, uncomfortably loud in my ears. William glanced down at the folder one final time before looking back into the audience. "His name," he said, "is Ethan Carter." The room seemed to inhale all at once. Then silence. Complete silence. I felt every eye turn toward our table. Executives, board members, investors, department heads, people who had never noticed me before were suddenly staring as if they had just discovered someone entirely different. Beside me, Rebecca went completely still. The confident smile she had worn all evening vanished so quickly it almost looked painful. William continued speaking before anyone could react. Ethan never requested recognition for his work. In fact, he actively avoided it. Several members of leadership recommended formal acknowledgement at the time. He declined every proposal. A few surprised murmurs moved through the room. William smiled. His exact words were, "The company succeeded. That is enough." Soft laughter spread through the audience. Not mocking laughter, respectful laughter. The kind reserved for stories people admire. I remembered saying those words. I had meant them. At the time, recognition felt unnecessary. The work mattered more than the credit. William nodded toward the large screen behind him. A new image appeared. My old employee photo from 8 years earlier. Younger, less gray, looking slightly uncomfortable in front of a camera. The audience laughed again. Even I smiled. Since then, William continued, Ethan has contributed to dozens of major initiatives, most of them without public acknowledgement. Many of them without people realizing he was involved. More images appeared, project teams, manufacturing facilities, system diagrams, reports I had forgotten existed, years of work flashing across the giant screen behind the stage. The strange part was not seeing the projects. It was seeing them all together. Most careers happen one day at a time. Looking at them collected in one place felt like watching someone else's life. William's voice softened slightly. Leadership is often misunderstood. Many believe leadership belongs to those with the highest titles, the largest offices, the most visibility. He paused. I disagree. The ballroom remained silent. Leadership belongs to people who make everyone around them better. People who solve problems without seeking applause. People who choose responsibility even when nobody is watching. Then he looked directly at me again. Ethan Carter represents that kind of leadership. Something shifted in the room. I could feel it. The atmosphere changed. The same executives who barely noticed me an hour earlier were now nodding in agreement. Some smiled. Others applauded quietly before the applause spread further. Rebecca sat motionless beside me. Her eyes never left the stage. William raised one hand, gently quieting the applause. There is one more thing. The room settled immediately. When I arrived this evening, I overheard a conversation. My stomach tightened. Across the ballroom, several executives exchanged confused looks. William's expression remained calm, controlled, deliberate. I heard someone suggest that Ethan was the least important person in this room. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody looked at their phones. The ballroom sat in absolute silence beneath the glow of the chandeliers as William Harrington allowed his words to settle over the room. He did not sound angry. That was what made the moment so powerful. His voice remained calm, professional, controlled. I have spent more than 30 years building companies, he continued, and one lesson has remained true in every boardroom, every factory, every office I have ever entered. He paused briefly. The people creating the most value are not always the people receiving the most attention. The audience listened without making a sound. William glanced toward me again. Titles matter. Experience matters. Leadership matters, but character matters more. Then he smiled faintly. And if I had to choose between a room full of impressive resumes and one person I could trust to do the right thing when nobody was watching, I would choose Ethan Carter every single time. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they praised my work, because they acknowledged something deeper, something I had spent years trying to live by. Around the ballroom, executives began nodding. Several people started applauding. The applause spread quickly from one table to another until the entire room joined in. I looked around and saw faces that had ignored me all evening now watching with genuine respect. Some smiled. Others raised their glasses. A few senior leaders I barely knew stood from their seats first. Then more followed. Then entire sections of the ballroom rose together. Within seconds, hundreds of people were standing. The applause filled every corner of the room. It echoed off the walls and rolled across the ballroom like a wave. I sat frozen for a moment. Not because I wanted attention, because I never expected any of this. Beside me, Rebecca looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Earlier that evening she had moved through the room with complete confidence. Now she stared at the stage in stunned silence. The realization unfolding across her face was impossible to miss. The same people she had spent years trying to impress were now honoring the man she had dismissed. William waited until the applause softened. Then he reached toward a small box resting beside the podium. "There is one final thing," he said. An assistant stepped forward carrying a framed award. The audience immediately grew quiet again. "This recognition was originally prepared several years ago," William explained. "The recipient refused it." Laughter moved through the crowd. William smiled. "Tonight I am not asking." More laughter followed, warmer this time. He lifted the award and looked directly toward my table. "Ethan, would you join me on stage?" For a second I considered saying no. Old habits die hard. But something told me this moment was not really about me anymore. Slowly I stood. The applause returned immediately, louder than before. As I walked toward the stage, people reached out to shake my hand. Others offered congratulations. Several executives introduced themselves despite having worked around me for years. I climbed the steps and joined William beneath the bright lights. He handed me the award, then leaned closer and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "Some people spend their entire careers chasing respect," he said. "You earned it a long time ago." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations I never expected to have. People I had seen in hallways for years suddenly wanted to hear my perspective. Executives introduced me to investors. Board members thanked me for projects I assumed everyone had forgotten. The strange thing was that none of it felt as important as I once imagined it would. Recognition is satisfying, but only for a moment. What stays with you is something deeper: respect. And respect means very little when it arrives from strangers but disappears at home. By the time the gala ended, the ballroom had begun to empty. Staff cleared tables. The music softened. Guests drifted toward elevators and valet stations carrying gift bags and business cards. I stood near the entrance holding the award William had given me. The polished frame reflected the lobby lights as people continued stopping to shake my hand on their way out. Eventually the crowd thinned. Eventually the noise faded. Eventually it was just Rebecca and me walking through the hotel lobby toward the parking garage. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Our footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The silence felt heavier than any conversation we could have had. Finally Rebecca stopped walking. I turned and saw something unfamiliar in her expression. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Regret. Genuine regret. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I am sorry." The words hung between us. Simple words. Honest words. Maybe the most honest words she had spoken all night. I looked at her and realized something important. Earlier that evening I would have done almost anything to hear that apology. Now I was not sure what to do with it. "I should never have said what I said," she continued. "I do not know why I did, but I knew why." The answer had been building for years. It was not one comment, not one bad night, not one mistake. It was a way of seeing people. a habit of measuring value through status and visibility, a habit that had slowly changed the person she used to be. I nodded slowly. I know, I said. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Can you forgive me? That question deserved a thoughtful answer. So I gave it one. I looked out through the glass wall of the lobby toward the city lights beyond. Then I said the only thing that felt true. Forgiveness is easy. She looked up hopefully. Trust is harder. Tears gathered in her eyes but never fell. For the first time all evening, there was nothing left to argue about. Because deep down she understood exactly what I meant. We resumed walking toward the garage. The distance between us was only a few feet, yet somehow it felt much larger. As we reached the car, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Emma. How was the boring party? I smiled. Then I typed back a simple response. Not boring after all. As I slipped the phone into my pocket, I realized something William Harrington had given me that night mattered far more than the award resting in my hands. He reminded me of something I had forgotten. Your value does not increase when powerful people recognize it. Your value was already there. The people who truly care about you are supposed to see it before the room does. And if they cannot, sooner or later the room stops being the problem.